in the pale dawn of European history, before the clang of coffee mugs and the tyranny of office calendars, there was breakfast. Or perhaps more accurately, there was not breakfast, which medieval people were famously good at. You see, for much of the early Middle Ages, eating in the morning was viewed less as a basic human need and more as a spiritual failing. Yes, really. Rising with the sun and reaching for a warm bowl of porridge might today be considered wholesome. It's practically the banner image on every mindfulness blog. But in medieval monasteries, it was a sign of gluttony, the first of the 7 deadly sins. Neatly arranged, just like a cursed charcuterie board. Monks, those preposterously well-behaved figures in brown robes, set the tone. Following the rule of Saint Benedict, many abbeys restricted food to strictly 2 meals a day, one at midday and one in the evening, unless it was a fast day, which, inconveniently, described roughly half the calendar year, and breakfast. That was for the infirm or the spiritually immature, or possibly for those meddlesome lay people who couldn't be trusted to starve on schedule. Yet, despite these strict rules, people still found time and justification for the sacred act of nibbling early. Labourers, for example, often began their day before sunrise. Try ploughing a frozen field on an empty stomach, and you'll quickly discover that pious self-denial has its limits. So, they would sneak in a bite of bread and cheese, or leftover pottage if they were lucky. A thick soup that looked like what happened when oatmeal fell in love with cabbage and settled down for a long simmer. Pottage, by the way, is an agricultural poem disguised as soup, an ever-shifting cauldron of boilable things. Barley, onions, carrots, herbs, and that elusive, romantic ingredient known as whatever was growing slightly more than mold in the corner of the cellar. It was infinitely simmered and rarely seasoned unless you consider a hint of goat to be a seasoning. But as grim as it sounds, the tradition lingered. Even centuries later, the idea of starting the day with a warm, humble, porridge-like dish has endured. In much of the world, a bowl of something vaguely grain-like and certainly beige still reigns supreme. Oatmeal, grits, congee, kasha, globally diverse, yes, but spiritually descended from medieval pottage and its cousin, gruel. Now, if you ever found soup cooling on a stone windowsill in a thatched medieval house, there's a good chance it wasn't being discarded, but saved for the next meal, sometimes tomorrow or 3 days from now. Refrigeration wasn't an option unless you happened to live inside a particularly temperamental cave. Food had to be cooked with longevity in mind. Hence, pottage wasn't just a meal, but a lifestyle, eternally bubbling, sometimes for days, a medieval slow cooker functioning without the electricity, recipes, or evidence of sanitation. It wasn't all grim, though. Pottage was communal, hearty, and dependable, as reliable as your neighbour's rooster screaming at 4 a.m. for reasons beyond mortal understanding. And when there was meat, even the most ordinary pottage became a cause for hushed celebration. The addition of bacon or salted beef transformed a peasant's dish into something practically noble. Though even then, it was not uncommon for meat to be so salted that biting into it could fossilize your teeth. Speaking of salt, salt, that glimmering mineral of consequence. In medieval kitchens, it was revered more than many family members and slightly less than the Virgin Mary. Salt preserved fish, cured meats, and rendered vegetables into edible relics. Without it, the entire winter diet would unravel into a melancholic festival of root vegetables and tears. Those who had it in abundance were considered quite posh. Those without, well, they had pottage, And so the morning traditions, muddled as they were, began to stick in small ways. The habit of starting your day with something warm and sustaining was less about luxury and more about the raw need to survive until lunch, which, depending on one's class and luck, could range from a simple hunk of bread to, well, another bowl of pottage dressed in yesterday's optimism. There's something quietly noble in this rhythm, isn't there? Rising with the sun, eating the same meal again and again, not because you must, but because within this unchanging bowl was a kind of soft-stitched identity, a comfort passed from spoon to spoon. Through centuries of invasions, reforms, and plagues, people held on to their porridge with the same tenacity they applied to superstition and homemade cheese. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's keep gently walking forward. Food, as it turns out, has never been just food. It's often performance, ritual, and the best excuse to avoid wars for a few minutes more. Imagine, if you will, the aroma of smoke curling from a thatched roof chimney, the creak of timber beams above, and a stew pot gently burbling away over the hearth. It's the 12th century, and dinner is exactly what you'd expect if you invited a peasant, a monk, and a goat farmer to the world's slowest potluck. Now, it might surprise modern eyes accustomed to rainbow-coloured smoothie bowls and barista foam art, but the most influential kitchen gadget of the medieval period was not, in fact, a spiralizer. No, it was the humble cauldron, a cast-iron relic that hung over the fire with grim determination, capable of enduring centuries of lumpy porridge and suspiciously long-boiled turnips. In many ways, this great cauldron was the slow cooker of yore. Only instead of setting a timer and scrolling your phone while quinoa simmers, medieval folk kept an attentive eye on their bubbling brew, mostly to make sure no rats fell in. Hygiene standards were, shall we say, aspirational. Communal stewing, besides feeding large households with limited ingredients, served a larger purpose, making absolutely everything taste vaguely like onion and cabbage. Yet, this peasant pot was also a place of innovation. Whatever wasn't nailed down, and occasionally, even if it was, could end up in the stew. Last night's bread? Toss it in. A handful of barley? Sure. Half a hedgehog your cousin ran over with a wagon? Well, waste not, want not. This perpetual broth, sometimes called ever soup or pottage, wasn't just a dish, it was a way of life. In some households, the cauldron contents might be simmering for days, even weeks. Picture a porridge with the tenacity of a Dickensian character and the flavour profile of a root vegetable's daydream. Now you may be wondering, how did people deal with flavour back then, in the absence of hot sauce and celebrity spice rubs? The answer lies not in a secret seasoning, but in the miracle of fermentation and the mysterious medieval asset known simply as the pickle. Ah yes, the pickle. A quiet hero in the culinary saga, responsible for keeping things edible when nature frankly stopped cooperating. Food preservation was not a quaint hobby back then. It was survival. Winter came not with wardrobe changes, but with salting, drying, and the knowing glance exchanged over a suspicious jerkin of mutton. People pickled anything that didn't sprint away fast enough. Onions, walnuts, eggs, even fish with ambitions. Vinegar, salt, and spices wrapped everything in a briny embrace, preserving nutrition and occasionally adding a zesty kick that distracted from, say, the disturbing grey colour of mystery meat. But let's talk bread. constant in this swirling medieval menu. Bread wasn't just eaten. It held your food, functioned as a spoon, and mopped up the last dismal dribble of lentil mush. And in an age before plates were mass-produced, or invented, depending who you ask, bread played the starring role of trenchers. These thick, stale slices formed edible dishware that soaked up stews and sauces before being casually tossed to the dogs, the poor, or the nearest monk with low standards. The upper crust, quite literally, fared better. Wealthy tables might serve finely milled white bread, a status symbol, since it required sifting out all those pesky bran bits. Whole grains were for the common folk, and ironically, for people today paying $14 a loaf in artisanal bakeries. And yes, cutlery technically existed, but knives were more like mini swords and forks. Ah, the maligned fork. This two-pronged curiosity was once deemed the devil's tines by suspicious scholars, who thought stabbing one's food with a tiny trident was suspiciously flamboyant. For a time, people preferred fingers, dexterous, washable, and perfect for scooping stews off a trencher. By the dim firelight, as wind whistled through the timbers and cats schemed underfoot, dinners were mostly quiet affairs, save for the slurping, of course. But the routines they practiced, slow cooking, pickling, and communal meals, stretched out across time. These habits didn't vanish. They lingered, reshaped but somehow eternal, like the lingering smell of cabbage in a wool tunic. As dinner cooled and mugs of weak ale were raised in sleepy gratitude, one couldn't help but notice that something else simmered alongside the soup. Something older than bread and almost as vital. Salt. But that is its own long-tailed tale. Now, imagine the year is 1348. You are a modest peasant named Elric, and your primary daily concerns are mud, sheep, and what the church has lately deemed an excessive interest in onions. But tonight, something monumental is happening. The manor is hosting a feast, and you, blessed by the crusty hand of fate, have been summoned to help in the kitchen, not to cook, of course, just to carry things. Peasants don't cook for nobles, unless they want their heads boiled as well. As you enter the smoky, cavernous great hall, your nostrils are immediately greeted by the improbable scent of boar, rosewater, and something that might be cloves, but more likely just the potboy's foot. The hall is alive with clatter and laughter, and you quickly realize something. No one, and I do mean no one, is using a fork. The fork, to a medieval diner, was suspicious. Yes, suspicious, as in diabolical shoe of Satan suspicious. They saw those sharp little prongs not as a helpful tool, but as instruments of vanity from the decadent East. After all, why delicately spear a piece of stewed pigeon when God gave you 10 perfectly good fingers, plus a knife the length of your forearm? Into this mess of merriment enters the trencher. Now, this is not an obscure Norse folk instrument, though it does sound like it should be played by someone named Bjorn. No, trenchers were edible plates, essentially thick slabs of yesterday's bread, stale but sturdy, like a baker with too many unpaid tabs. Nobles would pile meat and sauce onto these carb carpets, nibble what seemed hygienically acceptable, and toss the rest to the poor. On feast days, being poor meant free sloppy seconds and a moral lesson in class structure, all served lukewarm. Now, before you wrinkle your sleepy nose at the idea of gravy-soaked bread plates, consider this. Trenchers were the medieval precursor to the modern open-face sandwich. Yes, you and your avocado toast are walking in the footsteps of barons. Next to the trencher is a sauce so bright green it would glow under a full moon. It's called verjuice, made from unripened grapes or crab apples, essentially medieval warheads. Sour was chic, you see, a fashionable counterpoint to all the heavy meats and chronic lack of refrigeration. They used generous quantities, of spices too, not to mask the taste of old meat, as the myth goes, but to flaunt their wealth. Saffron was more precious than gold. Cinnamon was practically currency. And if you had mace in your dish, congratulations. You were actively eating part of a nutmeg's medieval security system. But what truly made the feast feel grand was what wasn't eaten, the performance. The courses often came out like acts in an elaborate play. Peacocks would be served redressed in their own feathers, posed proudly as if auditioning for a medieval shampoo commercial. And surtouts, themed sugar sculptures, were made to resemble castles, saints, or elaborate political insults you could technically digest. They didn't always taste good, but they told a story. And if the guests fell asleep into their trenchers afterward, well, that was just a bonus. At the corner of the hall, a young boy appears with a flagon almost as big as he is. Mead, ale, or spiced wine, whatever it is, it's stronger than modern sense. Water, of course, wasn't to be trusted. In fact, ale was considered a breakfast beverage. Children drank it, monks brewed it. Everyone was, to some gentle degree, slightly smudgy in the head all day. And now Elric, belly full of noble leftovers and brain gently warmed by barley-based hydration, wanders home beneath a velvet night sky. The stars wink politely, as if they too attended the feast and found the peacock a touch dry. But as Elric lies down on his pallet of straw, still tasting hints of sage and garlic, he dreams of something far finer than wine or roast goose. He dreams of cheese. Ah yes, cheese in the medieval world wouldn't just be cheddar and brie. It had a life, a legal code, and a suspected affair with saints, monks, and clever dairymaids. Let us tiptoe softly into that tale, shall we? As dust settled over the candlelit dining halls of medieval manors, something curious began to happen. The sounds of harp strings, the clinking of pewter cups, the occasional scolding of a page boy tipping over a jug of mead. These were all background to the main performance, not a theatrical play, but the pageantry of food itself. Now, listen closely, and don't giggle too loud into your pillow, because tonight we turn our dreamy gaze toward one of the most wonderfully strange customs of medieval dining. How your dinner was not truly your dinner, unless it was disguised as something else entirely. Ah yes, we're wading waist-deep into the realm of illusion foods, where roast peacocks wore their feathers back to the table and fish pies sometimes blinked at you if the cook was feeling puckish. It all stemmed from a simple medieval rule. Your dinner should be more impressive than your guests, especially if your guests were, well, royalty with tempers and swords. And so, chefs, though back then they were more humbly titled cookies or kitcheneers, became stage magicians of the meat world. Imagine being invited to a feast in the 14th century. You nervously tuck your linen napkin, not paper, darling. Paper napkins would be centuries away, into the neck of your tunic. The plate before you, is it cake? Is it meat? Is it a pie shaped like a castle belching steam? It could be all of those things, and yet none of them. Medieval cooks were quite fond of what they called subtleties, culinary sculptures meant to surprise, delight, and occasionally confuse the barefoot peasantry watching from the corridor. These weren't your average ham sandwiches. These were boars' heads made to talk using bellows, or blancmange molded to look like swans. Think of early special effects, but in gelatin form. One particularly charming example comes from a banquet thrown by King Henry VIII, a man who never said no to ham in any form. His cooks unveiled a pie, not just any pie, mind you, but one containing live birds. Yes, real, breathing birds. When the pie crust was sliced open, out they flew, feathers fluttering, cooing indignantly at the poor soul with gravy in their hair. And just like that, you have the origins of 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Serve with a side of surprise and a mild panic attack. But why birds in pie? You murmur sleepily, now half cocooned in your comforter. Why sculpt marzipan into hedgehogs or bake an eel into the shape of a trumpet? In part, it was to show off wealth. Sweets were expensive, spices more so, and sugar, that shimmering treasure of the eastern trade routes, was worth its weight in gold teeth. To shape a dessert into something useless, that was the kind of madness only the rich could afford. But it was also, oddly, about fun. Fun in an age known for plagues, muddy roads, and the occasional neighbour-related jousting fatality. In a world where bathing was rare and Latin was required to ask for the salt, food was a universal language of delight, even if it sometimes required translation or an apology to startled birds. Remarkably, illusion food didn't entirely vanish. Centuries meandered by, this love for edible whimsy pirouetting its way through history. Today, we still serve cakes that look like tacos, birthday confections styled after gardening tools, and even the occasional meatloaf disguised convincingly as a kitten, a choice that raises questions but also eyebrows and sometimes forks. Just as the medievals knew, food designed to spark wonder sticks with us. It's the joyful mischief between bites, the pause of surprise before the laugh, the childlike glee that makes us forget table manners just long enough to applaud a clever turnip carving. And in that flicker of delight, we share a moment across time with the young page boy sneaking a taste of marchpane hedgehog, his eyes wide with wonder and sugar. As flickering torches give way to sputtering candle stubs and the illusion birds find their perch in your dreams, let's stretch and settle in for the next course. For what is dinner without a proper bread? And what is bread without a very old, suspiciously brown, medieval secret? Let's drift that way, softly, far beyond the banquets of courtiers and the murky cauldrons of turnip soup. There is a quieter tale bubbling gently in the background of history, that of bread. Not the soul-searching sourdough of today's Instagrammable moments, nor the sliced supermarket loaf, known mostly for its uncanny ability to return to its original form when squished. No, we're speaking of medieval bread, crusty, heavy, enigmatic, and sometimes, occasionally, alive. Bread, in medieval Europe, was not simply food. It was infrastructure, a tool, a measuring system, a serving dish, in some cases, a weapon. And unless you were very genteel and rather lucky, bread was, more often than not, a whole-grain gamble, half stone, half carbohydrate, and wholly charming in its anachronistic utility. Let's begin with the trencher, not a type of raincoat nor a touching war poem, but rather a chunk of bread so thick and sturdy it served as a plate. That's right, your meal didn't rest on dainty ceramic, but on a slab of yesterday's baked loaf. The trencher absorbed the juices, the grease, and the occasional stray bit of mutton. And when you were finished eating, instead of tossing the plate in the sink, you handed it off to a servant, the poor, or if spirits were high and hygiene low, ate it your very self. Trenchers came with regional flair. In noble houses, they might be made fresh expressly for the feast, then discarded to beggars as a form of edible charity. In humbler homes, they were bread that had truly lived, reused, repurposed, possibly possessing its own small folklore. As in, that's old Nan's trencher. Don't sit on it, she still speaks through it occasionally. Now, why did people start using bread as dishware in the first place? The likely answer is that dishes were expensive, and you couldn't eat a dish. But with bread, well, someone could eventually. In a world where nothing was wasted and everything had its role in the great cycle of chewing and digesting, bread became more than food. It was a centerpiece of civilization. The next stop on our rustic carbohydrate journey brings us to the bread laws. Maybe not bedtime material, you say? But wait. Few things are dreamier than regulation when covered in a light medieval glaze. The Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted in England as early as 1266, is one of the oldest laws that systematically regulated food. It declared, in rather serious tones, the precise weight and price a loaf of bread should be sold at, depending on the current cost of wheat. The intent was noble. Keep prices fair and weights honest, thwarting the cunning baker who might pad out his loaves with sawdust, beans, or, if he was truly edgy, powdered chalk. Inspectors known as bread weighers roamed the streets, armed with scales and almost certainly self-importance, checking that bakers were true to grain. Those who cheated faced fines, losses, or iconic medieval punishments like the pillory, where they were locked up in wooden stocks and greeted with whatever the townsfolk had left in their lunch sacks. To avoid such public shaming, many bakers began adding an extra roll or portion to orders of 12, thus creating the phrase "a baker's dozen." This was not generosity, mind you, but a creative form of legal insurance. Give too much bread, and you're a kind and overcautious tradesman. Give too little, and you're pelted with onions by Janice with the powerful throwing arm. And of course, bread was not uniform across society. The wealthy enjoyed manchet, a lighter, airier white bread made from sifted flour, while peasants got maslin, a deliciously unpredictable mix of rye, barley, and sometimes, if the miller was in a whimsical mood, pebbles. Eating bread in these centuries was as much about understanding your place in the world as it was about chewing. Your loaf told people who you were, your class, your means, whether you might one day rise to knighthood or return home with a broken molar. As you settle deeper into your pillow now, imagine the glow of candlelight reflecting off rows of crusty trenchers, the scent of yeast holding a room together like invisible wallpaper, and the gentle crunch of someone perhaps biting down on something that should not, in any theoretical way, have been part of the flour mix. But no one said medieval meals were perfect. They were just plentiful, peculiar, and surprisingly persistent. From sourdough plates to governmental grain math, bread truly held together the fabric of medieval life. And while its forms have changed, the warmth of a fresh loaf remains timeless. Close your eyes now and drift gently toward another delicacy of the distant past, one that came with feathers, squawks, and occasionally shoes. At a certain point in the late Middle Ages, around the time most people's last names started being things like Baker, Cook, or Fletcher, which is not someone who makes arrows, but let's pretend for their self-esteem. Food preparation in Europe became ever so slightly less about survival and ever so slightly more about theatre. This was not theatre in the modern sense, of course. No velvet curtains or intermissions with overpriced snacks. No, this was gustatory theatre. The kind where your boiled peacock arrives recloaked in its original feathers, head reattached with a spicy mustard glaze, eyes replaced with sapphires, or more economically, glazed gooseberries. and the whole creature makes its debut on a silver tray with the seriousness of a royal ambassador. It was all part of the medieval banquet, and perhaps no single event better captured the mix of culinary creativity, peculiar priorities, and deep desire to impress one's neighbors than the grand entremet. Now, an entremet, spelled with just the right number of unnecessary letters, was a dish served not merely to fill the belly, but to boggle the mind, a kind of edible intermission. Somewhere between acts of roasted venison and whole trout stuffed with almonds and self-importance, you might be presented with what appeared to be a castle made entirely of sugar, or a jelly moulded in the shape of a swan, or, in one particularly record-setting case, a pie from which a live musician emerged, playing a very small trumpet. Never let it be said that the medieval elite did not know how to throw an edible curveball. Of course, most of this was confined to the upper crust, both socially and literally, as many early meat pies came, with a thick pastry shell that was meant to be a container rather than a treat, known as a coffin, because apparently medieval chefs were as dramatic as their dishes. Still, these extravagant culinary customs, with their golden roasted beasts and marzipan miracles, helped shape certain traditions we still warm to today, like the notion that a dinner party should be more than just food on a plate, your grandma's cheese ball encrusted in nut shards, a direct descendant of the Middle Ages having a little too much fun with almond paste, that towering wedding cake designed to defy gravity and modesty, echoes of sugar castles and theatrical flourishes from the age of chainmail chic. Even presentation, which now earns its own judging category on cooking shows, finds its glimmering origin in the medieval feast. When you see someone balance microgreens on a sliver of trout with the concentration of a surgeon, remember it all started when someone decided to recreate a biblical scene using poultry and a potato. But lest we romanticize too much, it's worth remembering that most of these shows of culinary splendor were happening in candlelit halls, surrounded by the smell of unwashed velvet, and various successions of knights explaining things uninvited. Also, refrigerated storage was still a concept as imaginary as dragons, although dragons, at least, were sometimes featured in cake form. The less affluent, aka almost everyone, watched from literal fences or heard the feasting through thin cottage walls and settled for humble stews named after whatever was found in them. Peasant food of the time was largely a choose-your-own root vegetable adventure, held together by barley and blind optimism. But even here, little flickers of creativity emerged, herbs tucked into dough, soups stirred with dried apple slices for sweetness, and on feast days, meat pies, their fillings tucked into dough coffins, as if the pig had one last hurrah to attend. Oddly, the medieval practice of food as performance has trickled down through the centuries like gravy on a fancy roast. We don't host jousts between courses anymore, but we do perform our cooking on social media, complete with captions such as "sourdough woke up like this, ever baked something just to post it." You, my dear, are participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition of edible exhibitionism. Tonight, as you drift between epochs of barley porridge and meringue swans, consider this: the desire to make food beautiful, to gather around it, and to celebrate it with flair. That was not invented on Instagram. It was perfected long ago by people who also thought juggling dwarves and edible castles were entirely appropriate party fare. And as the feast candles flicker lower and sugar horses trot gently into memory, we may now quietly tiptoe into a humbler corner of the medieval kitchen, where spices, more precious than gold, awaited their destiny. by the flickering light of a greasy tallow candle, whose aroma was suspiciously reminiscent of mutton drippings. A medieval host might lean across a wooden trencher and warmly declare that it was time for the entremet. Now, should that word conjure images of delicate French pastries filled with cloud-like creme and peppermint-scented air, please tuck that notion back into your velvet purse of modern expectations. In the medieval banquet hall, the entremet was not dessert. Oh no, it was pageantry disguised as protein. Some entremets were edible, like spiced meat pies dyed gold and garnished with feathers for dramatic flair. Others were less edible, more theatrical. Imagine the sudden appearance of a roasted swan reassembled into its feathered glory, eyes aglint with tiny rubies. Or consider an entire boar gilded with lard and thunderously rolled into the hall upon a wheeled wooden sleigh. These feasts were less about nutrition and more about awe. Bread for the table, splendor for the soul. But let us not drift too deeply into dazzle before supper. First, we must set the stage properly. Meals in medieval Europe weren't simply times to eat. They were events, complete with trays of symbolism, unspoken social codes, and recipes that required a certain ecclesiastical boldness. Monks with too much honey, for instance, invented mead. Nuns with spare herbs invented digestives. And somewhere in the corner, a noble's cook, equal parts artist and slight pyromaniac, was preparing a soup that refused to stop boiling 3 hours past dinner. Banquets in large manors or courts frequently followed a pattern. They'd start with the bring-in, the grand procession of food, each dish escorted like royalty, sometimes accompanied by musicians, jesters, and whatever animal survived rehearsal. The host might receive the first serving, not just as an honor, but so that if the dish was poisoned, well, one wouldn't want that fate befalling a guest. And here's where our modern dining customs sprout from those medieval roots, like chives from a thatched roof. Take the multi-course meal. Why do we eat in courses instead of piling all the food on the table like a harvest day free-for-all? In part because medieval banquets needed breathing room between spectacles. You couldn't exactly unveil a whole roasted peacock with a lyre-playing child hidden inside 2 minutes after serving the eel soup. At the heart of it all, there lay a peculiar medieval devotion to food geography, not in the modern farm-to-table sense, but more of a exotic-to-face approach. The more unfamiliar the dish, the more wondrous your standing. If your imported sugar molded into a castle sank in the gravy, it was still sugar, and that mattered. Yet, for all the gustatory theatre, there was always one star of the show, the humble spice. Yes, the medieval world's obsession with little fragrant powders remains one of history's more deliciously persistent quirks. Spices were status symbols back then. Pepper worth more than gold, saffron hoarded like royal treasure, and cinnamon whispered about in suspiciously hushed tones. Nobles didn't so much season their mutton as assert geopolitical dominance through it. The spice box, often locked and attended like the crown jewels, contained delights that shaped kingdoms. To sprinkle clove on your pears was to say, "Look what my connections to the Silk Road just did." And something funny happened. These spices became so deeply woven into recipes and rituals that even as centuries turned and swords became more ornamental than functional, we never entirely let them go. Pumpkin spice lattes owe their lineage not to American fall-themed marketing alone, but to centuries of European cooks attempting to preserve slowly fading luxury tastes in squash-based formats. So if you've ever tasted a dense fruitcake and thought, what on earth compelled humanity to do this? know that somewhere in that sticky brick of nuts and ambition lies the ghost of a medieval kitchen where a cook once said, "Let's preserve this plum with enough cinnamon to bankrupt a merchant," and nobody argued. But amid all this ostentation and spice-fueled revelry, there was one curious absence at the medieval table: the fork. Its journey was fraught, its reception dubious, and its reputation oddly scandalous. Yes, that rather unassuming utensil waits quietly in our next tale, in the slow churn of medieval ambience, where the dusk glowed soft against timber-framed cottages and the world smelled faintly of damp wool and roasted onions. There glimmered one immortal tradition that still flickers on our plates today: the medieval banquet. Now, mind you, not every feast was a tapestry of roast boar and song. For most people, dinner looked more like a tired bowl of pottage and a prayer that the neighbour's cow didn't fall ill. But on grander occasions, the coronation of a king, or more likely, a noble using tax funds to celebrate Tuesday, people dined with flair both edible and absurd. Imagine a long, creaking oak table groaning under dishes whose names sound more like spells than food: Blawmanger, Cockentris, Subtlety. Candles flicker like sleepy fireflies as goblets of honeyed wine are passed from gloved hand to gloved hand, and someone's pet monkey is stealing a fig tart in the background. Ah, ambiance. But here's a gentle little mystery to rest your head upon. Why do some parts of these medieval food customs persist even now? Why, for example, do modern wedding cakes stretch into ridiculous tiers, iced like sugar-draped castles? Why do we insist on carving the turkey at the table like a knight preparing for chicken battle? Let's begin with presentation. In the days before plate your dish became something you yelled at a cooking contestant on television, medieval chefs had already mastered the art of culinary drama. Food was a performance. Swans were not only roasted, yes roasted, but then sewn back into their own feathered skins, posed majestically on platters like grimly delicious taxidermy. A subtlety was the medieval centerpiece of surprise, a whimsical, edible twist meant to dazzle. One famous record describes a pie from which live birds flew out when the crust was broken. Yes, a literal bird in a pie situation. Nursery rhymes weren't lying. This, by the way, is where our fascination with hidden center desserts may have flapped its tiny wings. Those jelly-filled donuts and multi-layered cakes with sprinkles inside. Medieval cooks would call that child's play, or rather, child's feast. But not all feasts were wild theatre. There was ritual too. The importance of the first dish, often a soup or broth, served to settle the stomach and spiritually warm the body. Something soft, like a properly simmered potage, was thought to prepare the inner humours. Now, before you imagine a medieval stand-up comic opening your stomach with gentle jokes, let's clarify. Humours were bodily fluids they really believed in. More than coffee even. Hot and moist foods pleased your blood, while cold and dry things troubled your spleen. Don't take it personally. This was just science. Medieval style. Even table manners have their roots draped in chainmail. Among noble classes, the art of carving, called trenchermanship, which sounds like the world's least dangerous profession, was the mark of grace. One didn't just hack the roast, one sliced with poetic precision. Soon, this led to carving being done at the table in front of guests, like a mini-show. Sound familiar? Yes. Every time someone serves a turkey on Thanksgiving with a speech and a carving knife, that's a direct descendant of trencherman theatrics. Congratulations, your uncle is unknowingly upholding medieval nobility. And bread. Oh, innocent golden bread. In medieval times, the trencher was a stale, flat slab of bread used as a disposable plate. After absorbing juices and flavors, it was either eaten or given to the poor. Today, we've upgraded the trencher to porcelain, but the idea of sopping up flavor with bread endures, with things like gravy-drenched stuffing or the sacred act of mopping your plate clean with a dinner roll when you think no one's looking. We see you. So did the medievals. Of course, over time, the grandiosity mellowed. Swans returned to lakes, pies stopped flapping, and people stopped boiling everything in mead. But the heart of the feast, celebration, spectacle, and the reverent pause before the first bite lingers with us still, like the scent of cinnamon on a drafty December breeze. Now, when you next sit at a long table and admire a sculpted dessert, or watch someone wield a carving knife like they're preparing to duel the roast, know this: you are witnessing delicious echoes of a past where food was legend and dinner was the real throne to sit upon. Let's wander now, slowly, like a court musician late for rehearsal, toward what they drank with all that spectacle, and how not all medieval beverages were as cozy as one might hope. Imagine the scene: a medieval banquet hall, gently flickering with firelight, tapestries drooping like dozy eyelids. The scent of roasted meats hangs like a lullaby in the air, and somewhere in the depths of a great pewter bowl, a jelly shaped like a castle wobbles regally in place. Tonight, we explore the humble yet rebellious medieval obsession with spices. Not just a dash of cinnamon here or a whisper of pepper there. No. We're talking an all-out spice palooza, where poultry tasted faintly of cinnamon toast and desserts hinted ominously of black pepper. You see, in the medieval mindset, more spice was more status, and fewer things soothed the medieval ego, like impressing your dinner guests with something that could both burn their tongues and bankrupt a small village. Spices weren't just for flavor. They were social currency with edible flair. To sprinkle nutmeg on a pottage was to say, I am both powerful and reckless with my finances. Cloves whispered prestige. Saffron screamed it in golden tones. And if your pumpkin stew wasn't tinged with at least 3 far-flung spices, you might as well serve boiled gravel. Why such fuss? Well, it all comes down to 2 delightfully medieval reasons. First, most local food tasted distressingly, like it came from the ground, which, surprise, it often did. And second, spices were exquisite imports, arriving after months of perilous trade. Their presence on a roasted goose's leg implied bold maritime bravado, dashing caravan journeys, and of course, royal tax evasion. Medieval cooks, those magicians of mortar and pestle, would grind cloves with enough zeal to scare the local alchemist. They'd turn pepper into powdery confetti, slather meats with it, then declare the flavor exotic, even if the goose underneath still tasted like despair and pond water. Now, despite what you might imagine, it wasn't merely nobles enjoying these pocket-sized aromatics from distant lands. Spices trickled down the social ladder too, much like an over-seasoned stew, slowly and unevenly. Festivals, church feasts, and mildly suspicious weddings offered peasants the rare thrill of slightly spiced legumes. Yes, we're talking lentils, with flair. And then there's garam's odd medieval cousin. Blame the Romans for this pungent, ghost-lingering sauce. In some pockets of Europe, enterprising cooks created fermented fish concoctions resembling liquid regret. They called it liquamen, or murray, depending on the pantry and the century. Introduced to pork, it gave an unforgettable flavor profile that hovered somewhere between bold And why does my mouth feel strange? Perhaps it was all intended to balance the humours. Remember the medieval obsession with bodily fluids? Of course you do. Clear phlegm, red bile, yellow bile, and whatever warm liquid courage they believed made up one's soul. According to dietary wisdom of the day, a heavy spice might warm a cold humour, or at least distract you from a mild toothache, which spice could also allegedly cure, provided you applied it directly to the skull with wine. But cooking wasn't blind chaos. Medieval recipes were, more or less, a gentle medieval jazz, predictable patterns with room to improvise between the lutes and livestock. A cookbook from 1390 England, known as the form of Curie, offers guidance like a sleepy uncle offering camping advice. Practical, but oddly poetic. Here's a favourite. Take good beef and smite it on gobbets, and cast it in a pot, and water thereto, and let it seethe, which in time's own sleepy whisper means, cut up beef, boil it, don't get fancy. To this, one might add saffron, because why not? And so the tradition of overspiced meats and confused desserts carried on, through courts, into monasteries, and across oceans. Even today, echoes sleep in our cinnamon-dusted toast and peppered sausages, survivors of a century-long flavour crusade. But like all good portions of medieval cuisine, there's another element quietly simmering beneath. It is the slow but unmistakable rise of mealtime manners, the concept that elbows oughtn't greet the gravy, and that it's rude to reach across the bread trencher. Yes, as feasts grew fancier and plates more spiced, so too did the pressure to behave while chewing. And that, sleepy listener, is where we drift next, into the curious codes of table conduct, from where to point your knife to when it's acceptable to wipe your hands on a dog. Sometimes, enduring culinary traditions spring not from a sense of taste or even culture, but from something far more powerful and ponderous: inventory management. Take, for example, the medieval love affair with stews. These bubbling, ever-simmering cauldrons of leftover everything were, in essence, history's slow cooker. But not in the Pinterest-perfect, dump some chicken and ranch dressing way. No, medieval stews were slow-cooked out of necessity, practicality, and the overwhelming desire not to let anything go to waste, including, how do we say this delicately, a questionable turnip someone forgot at the bottom of a storage barrel last October. Now, a good medieval stew didn't have a name. It had a mood, a vibe, something along the lines of Tuesday's regret and carrot ambition. Into the pot went yesterday's bread, today's onions, and any meat that hadn't entirely been claimed by the neighbourhood cats. And yet, despite its often, let's say, rustic ingredients, the medieval stew endures in our modern souls. How else do we explain our adoration for chili cook-offs and crock-pot casseroles? But it wasn't just the content of the stew that made it special. It was the pot itself. A good cauldron wasn't just a piece of cookware. It was an heirloom, a hearth-hugging artifact. Stories lingered in its soot. And while the pot never got washed in the way we might expect, prompting modern hygiene experts to enter a state known as visible distress, it did get lovingly stirred day after day by someone who probably only had two working teeth and more opinions on spice than sense. Herbs and seasonings in the stew were equally important, if only to distract from the meat's maturity. Adding a bit of sage, noble, tossing in rosemary, inspired, throwing in a whole bouquet of local weeds and hoping no one noticed the squirrel footprints. Well, that's just generous cooking. The secret ingredient, however, was often potluck. Not in the church basement sense, but rather the accidental charms left over from previous days, scraps of bacon perhaps, or the elusive pearl of a well-aged onion. These built flavor over time, slow as ivy and twice as mysterious. A kind of culinary compost that somehow tasted like comfort and self-doubt. But then came pottages, the close cousin of stew, like stew's more respectable sibling, who gets invited to events that require shoes. Pottage was slightly thicker and occurred most often in monastic kitchens, where monks lived on a diet of spiritual reflection and root vegetables. Monks, as it turns out, were rather good at creating humble but capable meals. They weren't searing duck breast or shaving truffles with a solemn chant. Rather, they used these hearty dishes to stretch tiny kitchen budgets across vast faith-based appetites. Over time, pottage recipes settled into peasant hearts and larders. Oats or barley served as the thickener, because why waste anything when oats are compliant and always available? If the village had a pig, it only appeared in pottage form once, maybe twice if they were fancy. The rest of the time, the pottage asked you to find joy in leeks, an historically brave request. Still, this way of cooking endured for centuries because it worked. You'd come in from a day of digging, hauling, praying or screaming at the sky during an ineffective fox hunt, and there'd be a pot of something warm and vaguely edible. The appeal was not the flavor, it was the continuity. You could count on your stew, even if occasionally counted back in gurgling bubbles. And this tradition didn't die with the quill or the crossbow. It evolved into gumbo, into beef bourguignon, into slow-simmered Sunday sauces, and the stubborn commitment people now have to sourdough starters. Because the idea of a food that grows better with time, with care, and with questionable oversight is, well, deeply comforting. Besides, in a world of uncertainty, there's elegance in a bubbling pot that remembers everything you've ever fed it. Sure, maybe it's slightly haunted, but that's called flavor development. And as the shadows grow longer in our tale, let's move from bubbling pots to the curious medieval logic behind bread so hard it could be used to bludgeon a heretic, or at least serve as an edible plate. Come closer. The breadcrumbs of history await if you find yourself savoring a warm bowl of stew on a rainy evening, preferably while wrapped in a blanket that smells faintly of lavender and well-meaning cats. You're partaking, without realizing it, in a culinary habit that reaches back through the ages in a line far longer than your grandma's recipe box. Let us float now to the smoky kitchens of medieval Europe, where stews weren't just a dish, they were a daily life strategy. In a world where refrigeration was as fictional as dragons, but somehow dragons got more press, people got creative with preservation. Enter the mighty pottage. Pottage was the Swiss army knife of the medieval cookpot, not because it was unusually sharp or foldable, sadly, but because it was adaptable. It was made by tossing whatever was edible and legal into a cauldron and letting it simmer until the flavors had no choice but to get along. Parsnips, barley, a suspicious turnip, onions, wild herbs, perhaps a scrap of bacon fat if it was feast day, or if your neighbor lost a pig. This slow simmering concoction would bubble over the hearth for days. Yes, you heard correctly. Days. It wasn't reheated. It simply never stopped being heated. Like the office coffee pot that never quite runs out, but somehow keeps going as the sludge gets darker and more mysterious with every passing hour. Served daily, often twice or thrice, pottage could evolve. It was a culinary chameleon. Add cabbage on Tuesday, lentils on Wednesday. perhaps a handful of dried peas from last year's harvest on Thursday, and you've got a dish that tastes just a little different each time, but still feels like home. If your home had no ventilation, and the air always smelled faintly of stew and livestock. So now we ask, why did this particular food tradition not only survive, but subtly shape how we eat today? Because we are, at heart, still stew people. Even fancy modern chefs can't resist declaring something slow braised or gently simmered in aromatic broth sounds more delicious than bits of edible things cooked in a pot until they're all the same shape. But that's the secret. It's still pottage, just with better lighting and a sprig of parsley on top. Let's talk servingware. In medieval Europe, they often ate from trenchers, thick slabs of day-old bread that served as plates. That way, when the stew soaked the trencher, the line between dish and dish disappeared entirely. No washing up required. The trencher would either be eaten at the end of the meal by the hungriest diner or donated to the poor, which was a generous way of saying, "Here, have some soggy bread infused with vague mutton essence." Is it surprising then that our fondness for edible bowls, like bread bowls filled with chowder, comes directly from this tradition? Fast forward, plop in some cheddar, and voila, culinary nostalgia. And have you ever noticed how every culture seems to have its own version of stews and broths? There's something ancient, something cell-deep, about needing food that hugs you back. It's not just calories and minerals, it's warmth, safety, continuity, and also a really good excuse to eat more bread. Another legacy of medieval stews is that they democratized the meal. Whether you were a lowly peasant or a high-born noble with a rooster-repelling velvet tunic, everyone understood the comfort of a hot bowl of something. Of course, nobles got fancier versions, often cooked with exotic spices like saffron or cinnamon they'd sourced in less than ethical ways. But structurally, still stew, still pottage, still that steaming bowl that made winter evenings bearable, even in stone castles with the insulation quality of a paper towel. It's said that you could tell the mood of a medieval household by the smell of their pottage. More garlic, probably happy. More onions, probably out of garlic. Bit of fish in today's mix. Oh no, it's Friday. And if you think this can't possibly affect your present-day dinner choices, think again. The next time you catch yourself adding just one more thing into your slow cooker, layering flavors like an ambitious Renaissance minstrel, layering limericks during peasant hour, you'll know. You're stirring the very essence of culinary time itself. But before we vanish entirely into that thick vapor of nostalgia and nutmeg, perhaps it's time to wander from the hearthside to the pantry, where we'll discover just how medieval spice traders accidentally changed the flavor of Tuesdays forever. There is a special kind of silence that descends over a medieval banquet just before dessert is served. Not the silence of anticipation exactly, but the polite, overstuffed hush of people wondering whether they've made a terrible mistake in eating a third helping of salted boar stew, and whether their delicate 14th century stomachs can endure one more bite of anything, especially if it's shaped like a hedgehog. Because yes, in the Middle Ages, some desserts were not just sweet. They were elaborate, strange, and, more often than not, mildly threatening in appearance. Let's begin with one of the more enduring medieval oddities, marchpane. A distant ancestor of marzipan, marchpane was a chewy, almond-based sweet that became a kind of edible sculpture medium for sugar-loving show-offs. Bakers and sugar artists, yes, that was a real profession, would fashion entire palaces, coats of arms, and even religious scenes out of marchpane. It's possible that at least one major theological debate began with someone accidentally eating the wrong apostle. Marchpane made its way through noble feasts and festive halls for centuries, and in a way, it never truly left. Though now marzipan is more likely to turn up in a modest fruit shape or covering a cake than masquerading as the Ark of the Covenant. But why did these peculiar sweets hang around for so long, when countless other, frankly more practical food traditions were lost to time? The answer lies partly in sugar. Specifically, that for much of the Middle Ages, sugar was precious, imported, expensive, mysterious, the kind of stuff you locked up in a chest with a key and prayed your nephew didn't mistake for bath salt. So when it appeared on the table, especially crafted into a garden of edible lilies or a lifelike peacock eating another, smaller peacock, it was a display of wealth, power, and a certain shared cultural agreement that food should surprise and mildly confuse you. Moving on from architecture you could snack on. One of the more lasting bits of medieval fooddom is the love of spice. In those times, spices were less about taste and more about television, by which I mean they gave people something to talk about at the table. Nutmeg, imported from mysterious lands. Cinnamon, a spice so luxurious that many Europeans believed it grew at the bottom of sacred lakes, guarded by mythical beasts. Honestly, these people didn't need Game of Thrones. They had the spice trade. So they used spices for sweet and savory foods alike. Apple tarts with black pepper, chicken with cloves, wine mulled with anything you could pound in a mortar and toss into a pot that wasn't on fire yet. Some of this has survived. That Christmas wine your aunt insists on making every year with a hint of something mysteriously gritty, that's the ghost of medieval mulling, and the excessive cinnamon in your breakfast oatmeal. Likely a modern echo of a medieval cook frowning at a loaf of spoiled bread and declaring with great confidence, "With enough ginger, no one will know." Now let's talk about trenchers. A trencher was a literal piece of bread used as a plate. It soaked up juices, sauces, and other drippings, and at the end of the meal, you could either eat your dish, literally, or donate it to the needy, assuming you didn't mind that the needy might be a pig, or, even worse, your cousin Nigel. While this tradition didn't exactly survive in its pure form, modern health codes strongly discourage eating plates. The idea of edible serving, vessels, is still lurking in our bread bowls and taco shells. Every time you eat soup out of a sourdough loaf, you are participating, however unwillingly, in a medieval table custom. And then, of course, there were the subtleties. Deceptive little dishes that looked like one thing but were secretly another. Think of it as the original food prank. A roasted apple that was, in fact, a stuffed meatball, or a fish that turned out to be a cake. Entire kitchens of cooks, apprentices, and disgruntled goats were sometimes enlisted to create these illusions, all so that the noble family could gasp in delight, or, in one recorded incident, total confusion. But perhaps the strongest thread tying our modern tables to the medieval ones is this: the enduring belief that food is more than fuel. It's theatre, it's magic, it's community. It's how you show love, wealth, skill, or at the very least, that you've gotten your hands on some saffron. As the embers fade in the great hearth and the flickering candlelight reflects off the last spoonful of quince and honey pudding, we wander from the banquet hall into the quieter corners of culinary history, where fermented curiosity and ancient hearsay begin to take on flavors of their own. At the heart of medieval flavor, like a well-aged wheel of cheese balanced on a cart that squeaks, we find one of the more curious culinary obsessions of the time: spices. Not just any spices, mind you. These were the sort of things you'd find in a merchant's satchel, guarded like loose jewels. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron. Delightful words today that might stir thoughts of cozy kitchens and seasonal lattes. But back then, these fragrant powders were as valuable as royal secretaries who could read without moving their lips. It's often said, usually over a plate of something excessively seasoned, that medieval folk piled on spices to mask the taste of spoiled meat, which is a bit like claiming people today add sprinkles to camouflage the taste of bad cake. It's not quite true, and definitely not that simple. In fact, medieval people liked spices for the same reason we chase after limited edition beverages and decor shaped like pumpkins in October, because it made them feel fancy. Imagine a noble's feast in, say, the 13th century. There's a peacock on the table, feathers still attached for presentation naturally, and beside it, a roast rabbit, generously dusted with a spice blend that cost more than the cook's annual wages. Every bite of that rabbit was a declaration. I can afford things that traveled farther than most people here ever will. Back then, spices came overland along the Silk Road or by ship through Arabic and Venetian traders, carried across deserts and kissed by countless customs officials. By the time a packet of ginger reached a London table, it had travelled more widely than the average monk and possibly knew more languages. Kings and bishops collected spices, using them not to hide flavour, but to create it. Recipes gleefully called for absurd combinations: cinnamon with fish, sugar with meat, peppercorns on pears. You might think they were daring or deranged, depending on your relationship with flavour and bold life decisions. Even among the less financially fortunate, spices trickled down in tiny amounts. A small jar of saffron could live in a kitchen for months, guarded like a sleeping dragon. Housewives would use the spice sparingly, just a pinch here, a whiff there, as if seasoning were a sacred ritual, which in a way it was. To season your food was to borrow glamour from the spice routes, to bless your stew with Sancho Panza levels of optimism. There's a charming logic to it, really. In an era when most of life was either cold, muddy, or infected with bubonic tendencies, putting a little nutmeg in your eel tart made it all feel a bit more celebratory. One must remember, too, how medieval medicine thought about tastes. The philosophy of balancing humours, a delightfully unscientific approach involving 4 bodily fluids and a deep trust in warm herbaceous broths, meant that spices were often as medicinal as they were delicious. Cloves were for cold temperaments. Pepper warmed the blood. And cinnamon, well, it could probably realign your stars and cure melancholy by mid-afternoon, if administered with enough optimism. Some spice blends even survive to this day. Take powder douce, a kind of medieval pumpkin spice predecessor consisting of cinnamon, sugar, and other warm notes. It made appearances in everything from meat pies to desserts, and somehow still sounds like something you'd buy in a modern cafe for $6.50 with oat milk. And saffron, that golden whisper-thin thread, persists in dishes worldwide, hinting at the kitchens of both queens and commoners past. One could argue that when we stir it into our rice or thread it through a risotto, we're not just adding colour, we're lighting a small, fragrant beacon across centuries. The modern craving for spice-laced comfort didn't begin on an Instagram page. It was born in candlelit halls where trenches of bread substituted for plates, and every sprinkle of cinnamon was a tiny act of hope. Hope that winter would pass. Hope that one's feudal obligations wouldn't be too taxing. Hope that the swan stew was, in fact, swan. And with that gentle flicker of medieval dining rooms still lingering soft and golden in the mind, we turn toward another tradition. One less aromatic, perhaps, but equally unexpected. For even the seating arrangements in these feasts have secrets worth whispering. Whispers of warm bread and the soft shuffle of wooden clogs fill this quiet little sliver of history. The year is somewhere in the late 1300s, and in a small medieval village with a name like Brockenshire-upon-Moss, something rather revolutionary is happening in the kitchen. No, it's not the debut of a new 5-course venison extravaganza, though venison was certainly fashionable if you could get your hands on a deer. It's the discovery, accidental or not, of soaking bread in egg and frying it. Yes, the humble beginnings of what we might, in our own time, call French toast. Though the French do claim it, pain perdu, or lost bread, as they romantically dubbed it, it wasn't just them. This crisp on the outside, soft on the inside culinary pillow had already made appearances across various cultures. The Romans had something similar called alita dulcia, and medieval cooks, ever resourceful and short on preservatives, found that slightly stale bread became quite a bit more charming when dipped in beaten egg and pan-sizzled with a hint of cinnamon and honey. From grand manors to thatched roof cottages, people gathered round crackling hearths as breakfast began to evolve from a simple crust to something slightly more ceremonious. Eat your heart out scrambled eggs. It's curious how this morning, masterpiece, survived so long, isn't it? Through plagues, dynasties, religious schisms, and trousers with far too many buttons, it endured. Perhaps because it is the edible equivalent of a warm hug, or perhaps because people have always hated wasting food. In medieval kitchens, economy was everything. Not the economic theory kind. There were no spreadsheets in the scullery, but the practical sort. Bread was a staple, baked en masse, and not always fresh. By day 3, it could double as a small defensive weapon, but if you softened that sturdy slice with egg and heat, it returned to the table, dignified and delicious. A transformation that was, in its own quiet way, alchemical. And let us not forget the medieval spice game, which was considerably more extravagant than you might expect. The upper crust, pun most definitely intended, adored spices like cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and nutmeg. Imported over land and sea, carried by camels, ships, and merchants with impressive beards, these treasured powders were costly, partly because they tasted spectacular, and partly because people firmly believed they helped balance the body's mysterious humours. So when cinnamon made its cameo in a dish of fried bread, it wasn't just culinary flair, it was health food. Truly, your 14th century breakfast could be classified as both indulgent and vaguely medicinal. A rare overlap. Frying, too, was a favoured technique, though not in the modern crispy chicken sandwich kind of way. It was practical. Heat oil or fat, plop in something edible, and you had yourself a meal without bothering with an oven. Those were massive community affairs, literally, located in the village centre and prone to unexpected goose invasions. But what's funniest, perhaps, is what we take for granted now. Eggs were not breakfast champions back then. They were dinner material just as much as morning fare. The art of assigning meals to specific times of day was a future quirk. So you might have your practically French toast for supper, accompanied by a mug of spiced ale and a hearty squint across the table at your neighbour. And they'd nod in silent approval, because you put stale bread to mighty good use. Even the utensils, or lack of them, played a role. Forks were still suspect. Most cut and scooped with knives and spoons, soaked crusts in broths, and did their best to keep sleeves clean. French toast, in all its softness, required little effort and less risk of losing your dinner to an overly ambitious jab of metal. Over centuries, the dish wandered, evolved, became sweeter, crispier, fluffier, but its core remained: survival, satisfaction, and the secret joy of turning leftovers into legend. And as twilight winds thread gently through the tall grass of our imagined Brockenshiire evening, you might hear the final sizzle of a pan, a sleepy cow grumbling in the distance, and the sound of a satisfied sigh. Another plate of near-forgotten genius served with golden edges and just a pinch of cinnamon. Now, speaking of spice and the curious ways it shaped our tastes, we might just wander northward into the cool, smoky larders of another storied dish that lingered like a good dream. At the heart of every feast in medieval Europe, nestled among suspicious pies and aggressively boiled vegetables, there sat a small but mighty monarch of the table, the spice mix. Now, spices weren't just add-ons or afterthoughts in the Middle Ages. They were the edible emblems of power, wealth, and a complete inability to store meat properly. When someone sprinkled a little cinnamon on their porridge or stirred saffron into their stew, it was less about flavor and more about bragging rights. "Look at me," they whispered silently through their spicy meal. "I've never even seen a turnip without import duty." Now, you may be cozied up in bed, wondering why some of the world's most coveted medieval food ingredients still exist in your grocery store instead of fading away, like the practice of drinking from shared trenchers or putting peacocks back in their feathers after cooking. The answer is delightfully tangled in spice routes, sea captains with questionable hygiene, and your great-great-great-grandparents' ongoing war against bland porridge. Let's begin with nutmeg. Today, you meet it gently dusted atop a cappuccino or nestled in your aunt's inexplicably famous holiday cookie recipe. But in the 14th century, nutmeg was more expensive than gold. People believed it could ward off plague, improve digestion, and possibly aid in the production of air, nay, regal, burbs. Entire explorations were launched for the sake of hunting down nutmeg trees in the Banda Islands, and wars were waged with a level of spice-induced fervor generally reserved for modern-day Twitter arguments. Then we must consider how pepper, common, boring little pepper, was once called black gold. In medieval kitchens, it was treated with reverence, hoarded in locked boxes, portioned as precisely as modern Wi-Fi passwords. To wield a tiny handful was to say, "Tonight, we dine with the dangerous glamour of a Venetian merchant." It did more than season food. It signaled status, knowledge of trade routes, and a solid invulnerability to blandness. But it wasn't just about flavor. Spices masked the scent and taste of meats that had journeyed a little too far beyond their expiration date. Refrigeration, as it turns out, had not yet been invented. Storage often involves salt, smoke, hope, and denial. Add 4 fistfuls of cloves and some allspice, and suddenly, you're not nibbling a questionable leg of something you hope was sheep. You're experiencing a noble delicacy treasured all the way from Constantinople to a small but proud village in Sussex. Another player on this spicy stage, ginger. Gingerbread figures, once baked only for holidays or royal events, were moulded into kings, queens, and perhaps even enemies with unfortunate noses. Yanking the head off the likeness of your least favorite tax collector was considered both a festive delight and subtle political commentary. No Yelp review needed. And of course, saffron, that golden thread that continues to make modern risottos feel approximately 44% fancier. In the Middle Ages, Saffron was so revered that it was occasionally smuggled across borders in false-bottomed crates and sewn into hems. Picture a medieval traveller hiding his spice stash, not in a suitcase, but inside his trousers. A dangerously fragrant fashion choice, but commitment nonetheless. Interestingly, these flavors endured not because they were essential, but because they became emotional. A nibble of cinnamon might remind someone of a grand feast from childhood, or the comfort of religious festivals. The spice wasn't just a flavor, it was memory, tradition, and proof that someone in your family tree once owned a tiny jar of cloves and knew how much to use without turning the soup into a medieval air freshener. As time passed and the world shrank with the help of ships, trains, and eventually people who thought overnight shipping meant 4 a.m. delivery, spices became more accessible. But the longing for their warmth, their ritual, and their storytelling never faded. Perhaps that's why, centuries later, we're still sipping chai, baking spice cakes, and measuring cinnamon not in dollars, but in joy. And so, as you drift just a little closer to sleep, imagine the fragrance of a medieval kitchen, of something sweet bubbling near the hearth, of noble ambitions wrapped in pastry, of old recipes passed by word of mouth and waistcoat. Close your eyes, for ahead lies a banquet hall of dreams, where even the turnips know how to twirl gracefully on the dance floor. There is something marvelously odd about how certain medieval dining traditions not only survived the centuries, but managed to sneak their way into our modern meals, dressed up and pretending they've never once shared a plate with a jellied eel. Tonight, we gently chew on one of the more peculiar habits that made its way from the timbered halls of yore, right into our contemporary kitchens, the curious case of the decorative pie. Ah, the medieval pie. Not the humble apple ones cooling on cartoons' windowsills, nor the pumpkin version squinting under a squiggle of whipped cream every November. No, the medieval pie was a whole different creature, often quite literally. Back then, a pie was not merely a dessert. It was a vessel, a theatre, a protein-packed surprise box with a deeply suspicious crust. Sometimes that crust was so tough and inedible, it functioned more like medieval Tupperware than food. It kept the meat inside safe from the air, the elements, and one presumes, the accidental judgment of a passing friar. It wasn't unusual for a noble feast to feature a pie with, say, a full quail, a lark, and possibly a partridge all stuffed inside, bones, beaks, the works. And at the height of culinary theatrics, pies were used as stages for live performances. There are written accounts, by people who appeared to maintain a straight face, of pies being served with live doves flying out upon the first cut. Yes, exploding pastries of pigeons. Nothing says bon appetit quite like your dinner taking off mid-course. Now, this might sound like something invented by Shakespeare on an absinthe bender, but it really happened. The trend was called entremets, a French term that delicately masks the fact that your dinner might do a somersault. These were no spontaneous flights of feathery fancy. They were carefully orchestrated displays, the medieval equivalent of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, except the hat was a pastry shell and the rabbit had probably already been eaten. Sometimes the pie didn't have birds at all. Sometimes it contained dwarves. Yes, small performers would hide inside pies and leap out mid-feast to sing songs or recite poetry, hopefully before anyone tried to dig in. Despite how spectacular and frankly alarming these meals could be, there was method behind the madness. The noble courts of medieval Europe were all about display, rank, wealth, power, and one's ability to hire someone to climb into a pie for an evening. At a time when literacy was rare and gold-threaded tunics weren't exactly comfortable, food became the ultimate mode of storytelling, status signaling, and occasionally accidental zoology. Surprisingly though, the decorative pie's soul lives on today, just in subtler, less aviary-threatening forms. Ever wonder why we still decorate our holiday pies with little leaves fashioned from leftover crust? Or why some British meat pies are topped with elaborate crimping and ornamental flourishes that have no bearing on taste or practicality? That's not your aunt getting carried away with cookie cutters. That's medieval showmanship echoing through the centuries like an edible ghost. Even the modern wedding cake, towering, tiered, sometimes structurally unsound, owes a nod to the medieval pie. In earlier times, spiced mince pies were often served at weddings as symbols of wealth and unity. Gradually, the pie gave way to sweet cakes, but the extravagant presentation stuck around. The height, the drama, the fear it might topple onto an unsuspecting bridesmaid, all thoroughly medieval in essence. And curiously, we still retain the tradition of cutting the pie, or cake, as a ceremonial event. In a world where we have pre-sliced bagels and sandwiches that come in triangle halves, taking a moment to cut through a dessert with solemn grace feels oddly reverent. And yes, a little medieval. Perhaps this says something sweet about us, that even now, in an age of sourdough influencers and microwave soufflés, we still find a little joy in food that tells more of a story than just, "I'm here to be eaten." That when we serve something with a golden crust and a sprig of fresh herbs, we're not just feeding bellies, but preserving a strange, spangled legacy of edible theatre. Speaking of dishes with a story to tell, there's another humble meal that's managed to persist, quietly simmering through the ages, quietly legendary, yet far less feathery than its pie-shaped cousin. The fire crackled in the open hearth, half-heartedly, tossing up the occasional lazy spark like it too had decided not to overdo things tonight. In a small stone kitchen somewhere in 13th century England, the smell of stewed leeks and barley gruel drifted sluggishly through the rafters. It was not the sort of smell that summoned delight. It wasn't the sharp rosemary of a Sunday roast or the sweetness of apples stewing in honey. No, this was the smell of subsistence. Humble, earthy, slightly beige if smells could have colours. And yet, amongst these simmering pots and soot-kissed kettles, you'd find something extraordinary. Ceremony. For the medieval kitchen, even when directed at food that tasted like wet burlap mixed with overcooked turnip, was a place of ritual. There was method, order, and the occasional superstition. Take, for instance, the curious case of trenchers. Not the soldiers, but the edible bread plates. Ah yes, picture this. Hearty slabs of coarse, day-old bread, 4 inches thick, designed not to be eaten immediately, but used as tableware. The medieval multitasker, a humble proto-dish. Meals were served upon them, sauces sunk into them, and when the nobility had their fill, the sauce-soaked remnants were generously handed to the poor. Call it medieval DoorDash, except it arrived cold, congealed, and pre-licked by a baron. Trenchers were food and function rolled into one, and while the trencher itself eventually yielded to the porcelain plate, thank heavens, the tradition of bread playing sidekick at our dinner tables never really left. That crusty roll or slice of sourdough by your dinner plate, a distant, yeast-risen cousin of the trencher, minus the gravy saturation and feudal guilt. Now, while we're swirling our wooden spoon through the bubbling stew pot of medieval delicacies, let us drift gently, like a weary carrot in broth, to the practice of seasoning. Though much ink has been spilled by dusty old historians shouting across parchment pages that medieval folk used spices to cover up rotting meat, I am here, softly and affectionately, to inform you that this is very likely nonsense. People in the Middle Ages were painfully aware when meat was past its prime. Even without modern refrigeration, they relied on salting, drying, pickling, or sending a prayer to Saint Apicius, the patron saint of not accidentally digesting botulism. Spices, particularly for the wealthy, weren't disguises, they were declarations. A piece of saffron-streaked roast was less about edible deception and more about financial exhibitionism. Cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from Indonesia, pepper from India. These weren't ingredients, these were glory. But here's the dreamy twist that loops all the way into your sleepy kitchen today. Many of our so-called traditional spice pairings, the fragrant cluster of cinnamon and clove with meat, the use of nutmeg in rich dishes, date straight back to medieval palates. Modern cooks inherited the quiet memory of those menus, handed down not in recipe books, but in flavor echoes and seasonal comfort. Think of a Christmas roast glazed in honey and studded with cloves. It sounds timeless, yes? But in the medieval kitchen, sweet and savory were not enemies locked in a condiment feud. They were dance partners. So the next time you hum your way through a recipe calling for cardamom in pot roast or ginger in a savory sauce, know that you're not being trendy. You're being accidentally historical. And speaking of dancing, there was a time when meals came with interludes. Between courses, noble diners were treated to performances, jugglers, musicians, or live falcons flapping a bit too close to the venison pie. But amidst all this pageantry was a serious devotion to this, how shall we say, culinary punctuality. It mattered not just what was eaten, but when and in what season. Seasonal eating wasn't a lifestyle trend featured in glossy magazines with lemon water on the cover. It was the only option unless one fancied chewing on dried beans and prayers. This medieval slow food culture, eating in rhythm with the land, is another sliver of tradition that crept quietly forward. Our modern farmers' markets may have replaced the thatched roof cart of the local mutton merchant, but the instincts are familiar. We still await the ripening of late summer tomatoes or the tenderness of spring greens, much like our ancestors who waited patiently and perhaps slightly hungrily for the cabbage to stop being rebellious. So as you begin to fade like the coals in that old kitchen fire, warmed by the idea that even your leftovers might have been considered a feast 800 years ago, know this: the past isn't gone. It's simmering softly beneath the surface of every stew. And as the night carries us onward like a spoon drifting lazily through thickened pottage, we shall next wander into kitchens not of the nobility, but of the common folk, the silent architects of our daily bread. By the time medieval Europe began to fully embrace the curious miracle known as a fork, something else had already nestled its way comfortably into most households: the communal dining custom of the trencher. Ah yes, few things say refined high society quite like devouring your dinner off a plate of week-old bread, which, we assure you, means you've made it. Trenchers were slices of bread, usually a few days past their peak, and shaped, more or less, into flat, edible platforms. These were your plates, but fret not. This wasn't a sign of medieval frugality gone overboard, more of a practical culinary two-for-one. First, the bread caught all the drippings of meat, sauce, and questionable medieval gravy. Then, once the meal concluded and conversation drifted toward pilgrimages and plagues, you had the unusual privilege of eating your plate. If you were nobility, of course, you didn't actually eat the trencher. You gave it to the peasants or the servants or the dogs, depending on the level of generosity and the habits of your household pets. It was a kind of disposable dishware that biodegraded in real time, eco-friendly, long before it was trendy. The medieval mind, centuries ahead in sustainability, albeit mostly by accident. And this simple hunk of edible tableware brings us ever so gently to one of the quiet culinary holdovers of the period, the way we still set a table and serve others. Yes, believe it or not, the reason you know what a starter or a main is, and why the soup comes before the roast. That's medieval etiquette whispering through time, like a particularly well-fed ghost. In grand medieval halls, meals arrived in what they charmingly called removes. These were not magic tricks or cases of disappearing food. No, each remove was just a round of dishes brought out in a sequence so as to impress the guests and confuse the kitchen staff. There could be 10 or more removes, starting with light fare, perhaps pottage with an indecisive texture, and gradually advancing to meat pies, swans. Yes, actual swans, hopefully not named. And then sweets, if noses hadn't already fallen off from too much spice. This layering of courses became a kind of theatrical performance, and over the centuries, it evolved into the way formal dinners are structured even today. You, reclining in your pajamas with a yogurt parfait on a tray table, have more in common with a 14th century French duke than you might have thought. Even salt, the great medieval treasure, pricier than your Wi-Fi bill on international roaming, played a quiet role in table traditions that persist. Highborn guests were seated above the salt, closer to the head of the table, where, you guessed it, the salt cellar reigned supreme in its glittering, lonely pedestal. To sit below the salt meant you were socially, let's say, mildly decorative. Not quite peasant tier, but you weren't going to inherit a castle anytime soon. Today, we still fuss about where people sit at important dinners. Wedding seating charts remain a battlefield of passive-aggressive diplomacy. It's the same old salt line, just with better upholstery. Then there's the napkin. You may think the humble napkin is a modern innovation, a byproduct of linen abundance and etiquette classes. But no, its medieval ancestor lived a wild and unpredictable life. In the early Middle Ages, diners commonly used the tablecloth as a communal napkin. That's right. Everyone wiped their greasy fingers on the table. Itself, a practice that continues today in very confident barbecue joints. Eventually, a more portable form was born, the handcloth or nappe, which you might politely venture to pronounce with a mysterious nasal flourish. These were often slung over the shoulder like a casual sword or tucked into one's girdle in the fashion of someone both dignified and permanently prepared to handle a chicken leg. As the centuries strolled onward, napkins became smaller, more distinct, and, dare we say it, civilized. And to this day, unless you're one of those people who refuses to use any napkin smaller than a tea towel, you're living a legacy. Feasts shrank, seating got less political, and trenchers gave way to ceramic plates. But the echoes of medieval mealtimes remain tucked in every formal dinner, every neatly folded linen square, every awkward moment when you're not sure which fork to use first. Answer, whichever one isn't secretly a shrimp fork in disguise. Now, as we gently let the candles flicker lower in the great hall of memory, we find ourselves drifting toward a most curious medieval mystery, the role of spices. Not just seasoning, but status, spectacle, and the makings of tales that spanned continents. Let's follow the scent, shall we? As twilight drowses over the flickering candlelit kitchens of the medieval past, we find ourselves delicately wading into the realm of edible contradictions, where medieval people, who often feared spices like they feared dragons, simultaneously spent small fortunes on them. Yes, this curious culinary paradox is served warm tonight, garnished lightly with cinnamon and laced with a whisper of black pepper. Imported spices prized not just for flavor, but for their mysterious power to elevate a dish, disguise questionable meat, and impress visiting friars. You might assume that medieval folk had dulled tongues and an iron stomach, dousing their meals in spice to mask the horror of meat gone. Slightly philosophical. Not quite. Food was often fresher than we give it credit for. Preservation through salting, smoking, and drying was common, and their markets saw regular deliveries. But spices were a status symbol, the medieval equivalent of a 4-car garage or a peacock in a waistcoat. Cloves, saffron, and mace could cost more than a horse, and when one must choose between soup seasoning and transportation, well, many chose soup. At noble feasts, dishes strutted out of kitchens like courtiers on parade, peacocks reassembled with their feathers after roasting, swans served in their full majestic plume, meats so heavily spiced they could double as small aromatherapy projects. The term subtlety was used to describe intricate dishes meant not for the palate, but to impress and confuse. Marchpane castles populated by sugar knights, or pies that flapped open revealing a small orchestra of live birds. Just in case you weren't sure dinner had started yet, spices weren't just culinary, they were performative. But beyond ostentation, there was something deeply symbolic at play. Spices hailing from India, the Moluccas, and distant lands unreachable without several climate shifts and at least one stormy sea, became imbued with nearly metaphysical meaning. They travelled thousands of miles along the Silk Road, through dusty bazaars, across trading vessels so creaky they groaned in iambic pentameter. What arrived in Europe wasn't just spice, it was mystery in a sack, exoticism powdered and ready to sprinkle over a goose. To eat spice, especially in the 13th or 14th century, was to claim one's cosmopolitan credentials, while probably sweating profusely under several layers of velvet. Even the church, which had many opinions on what one should do with one's body and soul, occasionally sang odes to spices. They weren't universally approved. After all, desire for flavor bordered on earthly indulgence. But in moderation, and especially during fasts, spices helped make bland Lenten fare a little less penitential. How else could one survive fish stew for 40 days? With great humility and a touch of imported cinnamon. By the late medieval period, a kind of spice hierarchy had emerged. Pepper, ever the reliable bachelor spice, was everywhere, accessible to both rich merchants and their slightly poorer cousins who lived beyond the city gates. But cardamom, ginger, and saffron, these were invitation-only spices. If pepper was the bread and butter of spice use, saffron was the artistic encore no one could afford, but everyone clapped for. Yet even as the Renaissance dawned and palates subtly shifted, many of those spice habits lingered on. Today, our enthusiastic sprinkle of black pepper, our saffron threads floating in paella, our clove-dotted hams at holiday tables, they whisper tales of medieval cooks layering mystery atop meat, delighting not only tongues, but eyes and imaginations. It's deliciously poetic that a pinch of nutmeg in a cup of hot milk can trace its lineage back to court dinners graced by dukes, duchesses, and one or two confused pigeons. Warm drinks spiced for winter, sweetmeats dusted with cinnamon. even apple pie gently cradling cloves. These remnants drift softly into the present, unaware of their ceremonial past. So the next time you stir your tea with a cinnamon stick or breath in the oddly fairy tale scent of mulled wine, you are, in a quietly noble way, participating in a medieval display of wealth, wonder, and undetectable food safety. And as we fold away the scent-stained tapestries of spice legacy, the kitchen grows quieter. The fire dims, glowing now like a sleepy ember at the center of the earth. Somewhere, a monk adds 1 clove too many to his broth and pours it into a wooden bowl, content in the knowledge that dinner will confuse and impress in equal measure. Now, let's ease into the next course of this quiet feast. There is perhaps no greater chasm between medieval minds and modern mouths than the curious custom of putting meat into pies. Not just dainty mincemeat parcels or fruit-filled pastries, with a hint of ham, mind you, but great, hulking constructions of pork, venison, and sometimes, rather unfortunately, swan. Yes, the medieval English had a profound culinary love affair with the meat pie, a passion that endures to this very day, albeit with less plumage. Back then, however, a pie wasn't just food. It was architecture, it was engineering. It was, in its own calorie-dense way, a statement of wealth, status, and domestic ambition. Because what good was a banquet if your guests weren't quietly wondering whether the pigeon inside the crust had been deboned? Often, it hadn't. These coffins, as they were seductively called, weren't originally meant to be particularly edible on the outside. The crusts were often rock-hard walls of baked flour and water, created not with appetite in mind but practicality. You see, without refrigeration, meat had an alarming tendency to develop character far faster than one might like, so it was sealed, like a scroll of parchment, in dough, to preserve it, protect it, and in some cases, entrap it. But the evolution from crustless container to our modern flaky fantasy didn't happen overnight. No, the crust had to earn its place at the table of edible delights. Over time, with the addition of fats like lard or sweet, these dense barriers began to transform. The walls came down, the flavor crept in, and before too long, people actually wanted to chew them. And the spectacle. Oh, the spectacle. Some pies didn't just contain meat. Some contained musicians, or so the stories go. There are records of noble feasts where the crust was stage, and inside were live birds waiting to flutter out upon slicing. Hence, that curious English nursery rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, and so on, which is either a surreal cooking instruction or a health and safety warning. This brings us to a peculiar moment in culinary history, the court of Henry VIII, a man with the appetite of 3 men and the restraint of none. His banquets were lavish affairs, featuring pies shaped extravagantly like castles, ships, or, in one memorable example, a wild boar riding a roast peacock. These creations weren't just served, they were unveiled, dramatically, under fanfare and torchlight. Tonight's dessert, mild indigestion and centuries of legend. Even outside the palaces, pie-making was communal and creative. There were fish pies in Lent, layered with herbs, and eel pies, served so often that riverside communities became known for them. The Thames had its eels, the North had its game, and each household passed down its own variation, like secret spells they whispered in flour and gravy. Fast forward to today, and the meat pie, minus some of the showmanship and unplucked feathers, remains a beloved comfort, food. The Cornish pasty, which once fed tin miners with its thick, crimped crust acting as an edible handle, now warms commuters on British train platforms. Shepherd's pie and its cousin, cottage pie, carry the spirit forward. Though curiously, both are technically not pies at all, having no pastry to speak of. But let's not ruin the illusion. Why didn't the tradition fade away? Perhaps because the medieval pie wasn't just about eating. It was about wrapping something humble in something hearty, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, and, let's face it, hiding things. Picky child at the table? Don't worry, it's just a pie. Doesn't matter what's inside. Could be carrots, could be squirrel. Who knows? Only the steward, and he's not talking. In many ways, the preservation of the pie represents a kind of edible nostalgia, a crusty echo from the past, filled with the collective comfort of all who've shared it. A warm, flurry continuum that somehow survived the plagues, the Puritans, and several courageous attempts by 1980s frozen dinner manufacturers to replace it with something called crustless quiche. And now, with your thoughts nestled warmly in flaky layers of pastry and improbable pigeon stories, we drift toward another timeless tradition that floated out of medieval feasts and somehow landed on our breakfast tables. Something both golden and endlessly toasted. But let's not rush our dreams. Gently now. Let the pie settle. On a drizzly Thursday afternoon in the 14th century, give or take a few roasted pigeons, a curious little substance was causing commotion in the dining halls of the moderately wealthy and the absolutely obsessed with digestion. This mystery marvel was not a spice or a sauce, but a powdered thing known as poudre douce, or sweet powder, a blend of cinnamon, ginger, sugar, and other warmish dreams that wandered into both desserts and meats, as if entirely unaware of modern menu categories. The medieval appetite had the subtlety of a punch bowl full of perfume, and the poudre douce was their edible declaration of luxury. At a time when salt could bankrupt a bishop, this sweet-scented powder was the equivalent of putting candied pearls on a saddle just because you could. But here's the charming twist. This dusty little flavor enhancer didn't stay confined to kingly feasts or monks with adventurous palates. No, it would sneak through the kitchens, over the moats, and into the hearts of everyday cooking. In fact, if you've ever passed through a contemporary kitchen where someone proudly adds a dash of cinnamon to chili or ginger to tea, you're witnessing the long aromatic echo of poudre douce still swirling like a spice ghost that refuses to move on. And speaking of echoes, let's meander into another course of our edible story. The humble pie. Not the pie of mathematicians, although that too is infinite and frequently slices awkwardly. No, we mean meat pies, those pastry-wrapped time capsules of vegetables, meat, and medieval ambition. Originally, pies weren't even meant to be eaten as a whole. The crust, or coffin, as it was robustly called, and yes, spelled just like that, was an edible container built to protect the precious fillings from soot, vermin, and the questionable hygiene of 14th century kitchens. It was the medieval version of Tupperware, though less satisfying to burp. Over time, these hardy crusts began softening into something delightfully flaky, and dinner tables across Europe fell in love, not only with what was inside, but with the crust itself. Their affection was so deep that even the apple pie, centuries later, would be falsely claimed as an all-American invention, but its roots, deeply and deliciously medieval. Now, if your eyes are getting heavy, let's soothe them with the tale of the trencher. Half bread, half plate, all medieval tableware. The trencher was often a thick slice of stale, bread used as a makeshift dish, soaking up whatever stew, sauce, or wildly over-seasoned mystery meat landed upon it. These bread plates weren't wasteful either. After your meal, you could eat your dish, or, if you were nobly charitable, donate the sodden thing to the less fortunate, a medieval version of clean up your plate, though with significantly more gravy saturation. This edible table stage left such a romantic crumbs trail that today's fondness for sourdough bowls filled with soup is, let's say, a far more photogenic descendant of the old stalwart trencher. And like its ancestral cousin, it still dares us not to eat the container. Wandering just a little further down the candlelit corridor of time, we arrive at the odd and enduring presence of saffron. This fair-haired spice, worth its weight in medieval gold, was so prized that it sparked smuggling rings, regulation acts, and the occasional duel. Today, we might find it sprinkled shyly over rice or tucked humbly into a custard. But back then, saffron was splashed about with the enthusiasm of an emperor in pajamas. To color your food golden was to announce to your guests that you were not only prosperous, but also steeped in good taste, despite the underlying fact that sometimes your meat still had feathers. And so, with pie crusts that evolved from fortresses into flaky temptations, spices that whispered their way through centuries, and sweet powders that blurred the line between dinner and dessert, we see how the quirks of medieval cuisine didn't so much disappear as they shapeshifted into the habits we now consider modern. Or in the case of cinnamon-soaked meatballs, confusing but oddly heartwarming. Let us drift now, quietly, into another tale. One that simmers just on the edge of sleep, patiently waiting in the flickering warmth of the kitchen hearth. Some of the strangest culinary customs survived the Middle Ages not because they were delicious, but because they were difficult. Not difficult like soufflés or a particularly tangled Christmas string light. No, difficult as in, why does this take 17 hours, 2 mules, and a prayer to St. Leonard to prepare? And yet, these were the traditions that stuck, because medieval food wasn't just sustenance, it was theatre, it was ritual, it was bragging rights, velvety stews poured over tedium and tradition. Consider the curious case of the trencher. Important sounding, isn't it? A trencher wasn't a tool for soldiers or a particularly aggressive gardener. It was, in the grand culinary wisdom of the 15th century, a hunk of stale bread pretending to be a plate. Yes, dinner plates in noble halls were made of yesterday's unwanted carbs. You had your venison stew or spicy lamprey pie delicately ladled onto a square of old bread, which slowly soaked up the juices like an edible sponge with dreams of becoming a stew itself. After the meal, guests could either eat the trencher, if they were very hungry or very unbothered by sogginess, give it to the poor who were waiting outside, watching, presumably, with the same patience one might give a cake at a window, or feed it to the dogs, noble beasts who never complained about medieval plating techniques. And before you ask, yes, eating off bread was considered refined. That's how far the bar was set. Around this time, forks were still viewed with suspicion in many corners of Europe. Some even called them the devil's tines, because only Satan, apparently, would want to poke his food before eating it. But back to the ritual of difficulty. Feasts with boar's head didn't just serve boar. Oh no, they paraded it in. Sometimes singing, sometimes gilded, sometimes carried on a silver platter by a nervous squire who knew one wrong step would land him in the moat. The boar's head would sometimes be decorated with lemons for eyes, though no one's exactly sure why citrus was the preferred ocular replacement. Perhaps it lent a zesty gaze, or maybe it just scanned the room accusingly. It wasn't the eating, you see, that mattered most in these feasts. It was the choreographed performance. the predictably unpredictable arrival of something absurd and difficult. Pie crusts that revealed live birds, exactly like in the nursery rhyme. Jelly moulded into the shape of castles, and in one notorious banquet held by the Duke of Burgundy in 1454, a giant pie was served, from which a live boy reportedly emerged to recite poetry, as you do. These overly complicated foods weren't meant for everyday folks, of course. The average farmer wasn't summoning live children from pastries or gilding roasted fowl. Their meals were more humble: porridge, onions, a bit of cheese if they'd been particularly lucky or excellent at milking that day. But even in the peasant kitchen, the echoes of difficulty lingered. Pottage, that thick, endless stew made from whatever grew in garden or hedgerow, was kept simmering for days at a time, sometimes weeks. It was added to, stirred, whispered to lovingly, a sort of communal cauldron of hopes, turnips, and slightly overcooked bits of yesterday. Why did some food traditions endure? Because they asked something of us. Time, effort, the patience to wait for bread to stale into dishware, the endurance to stir something thrice daily even when it started to smell like someone's shoes. They became rituals rooted in inconvenience, but oddly enough, that made them precious. They gave meals meaning beyond hunger. Even today, there's a bit of the medieval in our kitchens. Holiday roasts that take 13 hours and 4 YouTube tutorials. Desserts shaped like animals for no reason other than whimsy. The fact that we still bother to light birthday candles and carry the cake into the room like it's a magical offering. Deep down, we're still reenacting courtly feasts. Only now we call it Friendsgiving, and no one's dressed like a Viking, unless it's ironic. Which brings us next, gently toasted by memory and marinated in history, to something truly odd. The medieval obsession with food colour. Yes, colour. The more unnatural, the better. We'll meander there next, under the flickering glow of candlelit kitchens and saffron dreams. Picture, if you will, the interior of a medieval kitchen. All smoke-stained beams, low ceilings, and the buttery glow of candlelight dancing across pots large enough to bathe in. The air is thick with the fragrances of pottage, roasted root vegetables, and an herb garden's last will and testament. It is here, amid the warmth and the wafting of time, that some of our most enduring food traditions first planted their very stubborn roots. Medieval cooks, despite lacking sous vide machines or Instagram filters, were rather serious about impressing dinner guests. Not just with taste, mind you, but with drama. It wasn't enough for a dish to be delicious. It had to feel like a performance piece. Think of food as interpretive theatre, but edible and sometimes still blinking. For special occasions, a pie might arrive at the table looking nondescript, until its crust was ceremoniously cracked open to reveal live birds flapping out in panic. This was not only considered entertaining, but a fantastic way to spice up a feast, if not entirely legal by modern bird rights standards. While the flamboyant flair has mostly faded, goodbye, live pigeon pie, the spirit of presentation lives on. There is an obvious lineage between the medieval penchant for spectacle and our modern love of elaborate plating, fire-roasted things, and desserts that billow lavender fog like a wizard's daydream. We still gather around dishes meant to impress: the Thanksgiving turkey, the Christmas pudding set alight, the towering birthday cake that slightly sags on one side but sings with effort. It's all part of a centuries-long tradition of saying, "Behold, I made food, and it is marginally majestic." Then there's the curious case of spice, that ancient symbol of wealth, power, and the occasional overzealous application. In the Middle Ages, Spices weren't just a seasoning. They were a full-blown social statement. He who sprinkled saffron was likely rich enough to do so without weeping, and cinnamon was considered so posh that stirring it into your stew was a bit like driving a gilded carriage through a muddy village just to say, "Yes, peasants, my dinner smells better than your entire home." What's particularly charming is how some of these spicy ambitions have endured. Our modern kitchen cupboards still harbour exotics like cardamom and cloves, now freed from the exclusivity of medieval status and available to anyone with a grocery store and mild curiosity. Mulled wine, chai lattes, and heavily spiced holiday sweets all owe at least a whispered thanks to those early flavour hoarders. And then there are the rituals, behaviours so old and habitual they've fossilised into modern dinner table choreography. Take the phrase breaking bread. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just bread. It was often a trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as an edible plate. After the meal, if there were still trencher remains, and heaven help you if you'd gnawed through yours prematurely, they were sometimes donated to the poor or, occasionally, flung to the dogs with all the grace of a king discarding a royal napkin. Today, we mostly just slice nice loaves and pass them around politely, but there's an echo of that ancient food-sharing sensibility. Bread as communion, community, and carb-filled consensus. And communal eating itself, a medieval masterpiece. In the great halls of castles, monasteries, and even modest manors, mealtime was often a joint affair. Platters were shared, goblets passed with only minimal side-eye, and the idea of eating alone would have seemed alien at best and suspicious at worst. While modern life places a high value on solo snacking in the glow of a fridge light, the resurgence of long-table dinners and potluck picnics suggests our social stomachs haven't quite evolved beyond the feasting floor of the 15th century. Of course, not every tradition was a winner. Medieval folks also held strong to the idea that fruit should be cooked. Raw fruit was considered slightly uncivilized, possibly dangerous, and good heavens, definitely impolite if served at dinner. A raw apple. What are we Romans? Thankfully, modern palates revolted, and the banana lives to see daylight without culinary intervention. Still, woven through it all, the spices, the shared platters, the flaming puddings and bread-passing peace treaties, there's a through line, that at the heart of our dining traditions is something older than recipes and richer than sauces. The enduring human instinct to gather, feast, and occasionally show off a little with squirrels, made of sugar or roast peacocks, wearing their own feathers. And as the candlelight in that old kitchen fades into the hush of dusk, one tradition, perhaps the coziest of all, begins to take shape. The idea that food is not only for the body, but for the story. Let's follow that gentle aroma forward into the final course. As twilight settles over the ancient hills of your imagination, let us journey one last time across the rickety bridge of celery broth and mead-tinged memory, to glimpse the final glimmers of medieval cuisine and its oddly enduring echoes. You see, while many things were happily left in the dusty corners of parchment-stuffed castles, like duck liver pudding or the suspiciously casual use of swan fat, some medieval food traditions nestled into our daily lives like a sleepy cat curling around your ankles. Take, for example, the humble pie. Modern pies may come topped with a comforting swirl of whipped cream or a lattice of buttery pastry, but their ancestors, oh dear, were altogether less dignified. In the Middle Ages, pies were less dessert and more culinary containment strategy. The crust, or coffin, as it was pleasantly called, wasn't always meant to be eaten. It was a medieval Tupperware, really, designed to protect the filling from dirt, flames, and wandering rats, may or may not have had an advanced knowledge of siege warfare. And in these crusty vaults of dough, medieval cooks stored everything: spiced venison, minced eel, nuts, raisins, and, on enthusiastic occasions, entire songbirds. You may have heard of the nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," with its 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Yes, that rhyme wasn't sheer fantasy. In wealthier households, these pies truly did contain live birds, which would fly out dramatically at feasts in a spectacle best described as disturbing to modern diners. Yet, the pie persists. We simply located more agreeable things to put inside it, like apples or hope. Then there's the medieval obsession with spicing everything to the brink of sin. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ingredients once worth their weight in eccentric dukes, were used with joyful abandon. Why? Partially because spices were a show of wealth, yes, but also because, well, preservation was tricky, and sometimes food needed a little help not tasting like it had been rescued from the moat. Today, we continue this tradition with pumpkin spice lattes and cinnamon in our toast. Though we no longer pretend the drink proves one's lineage or dominance over the spice trade, we just like things that taste like warm hugs. Another quiet survivor of medieval kitchens is the ritual of the table. The very idea that certain foods go with certain meals at certain times, this tangle of etiquette came bubbling up from banquets long gone, where entire pages of seating arrangements were written by candlelight, and forks were considered newfangled wizardry. Forks, you see, didn't make their full debut until around the 11th century in Persia, and took centuries to become standard in Western Europe. Until then, it was fingers, knives, and occasionally eye contact strong enough to make the peas voluntary. We still reverently cling to those table rules, dressing dinner with napkins, naming courses with pomp, appetizer, entree, dessert. The language may have changed, but the ceremony remains, a distant echo of when eating was not just nourishment, but theatre, diplomacy, and a quiet game of guess what's under this pastry lid. Let us not forget the medieval obsession with feasting at specific times of the year, and how oddly this compulsion lives on. Harvest festivals became our Thanksgiving. Winter revelry, with spiced wines and roasted meats, turned into Christmas dinners crowned with hams and the occasional uncle in a sweater that threatens diplomacy. Even fasting traditions like Lent find culinary footprints in dishes like hot cross buns or meatless Fridays. Patterns of feasting and abstinence still colour our calendars in ways most of us never pause to question. Perhaps most charming of all is the bread trench. In the Middle Ages, the wealthy dined atop thick slabs of stale bread, trenches or trenchers, which soaked up juices from food ladled upon them. Once meals ended, the soggy bread often went to the poor, or to grateful dogs named things like Wolf and Butterpaw. Today, we still serve meals atop bread, open-faced sandwiches, bruschetta, avocado toast with a poached egg perched like a royal. It turns out we never really stopped eating from bread. We just made it fashionable. And so, dear listener, as the embers of this medieval banquet dim and your eyelids grow heavy, know that the past is not as far away as it seems. Each time you sprinkle cinnamon into cocoa, cut into a pie, or pass the bread at dinner, you're partaking in the quiet longevity of a world long gone, but not forgotten. For in the small clinks of your spoon against the bowl, in the warm smells that drift through quiet kitchens, the medieval table lives on, not as a museum piece, but as a gentle tradition, wrapped in pastry, garnished with herbs, and best enjoyed with someone you don't mind getting crumbs on. Now, close your eyes. Let the torches of the old candle-lit hall flicker out one by one and drift softly into dreams sweetened by honey and the faint, far-off laughter of cooks who once crowned a parsnip as art. Sleep well, for the feast is complete.